They tell you that the jungle has 1,000 eyes. They tell you that the heat and the humidity will make a man see things that aren't there. For 50 years, I let myself believe they were right. I let the doctors at the VA tell me it was combat fatigue or jungle rot of the mind. I let the officers in the debriefing room convince me that the shadows I saw moving through the canopy were just NVA snipers in sophisticated camouflage. But you don't forget the sound of a man's ribcage being snapped like dry kindling. You don't forget the smell of ozone and wet fur in a place that should only smell of damp earth and cordite. My name is Sergeant Robert Mackenzie. I was with the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, 3rd Marine Division. In April of 1968, my squad was sent to a place the maps called Hill 881 North. By the time we were extracted 72 hours later, I was the only one left who could still speak. The others were either dead or had their minds fractured so badly they spent the rest of their lives staring at walls in padded rooms. I'm 80 years old now. I've outlived my wife, my friends, and the men who told me to stay silent. I'm recording this because the dreams haven't stopped. Because every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that green hell, listening to the clicking sound in the trees. It's time the world knew what really happened on Hill 881. It wasn't the Viet Cong that took my boys. It was something that has lived in those mountains since before the first human set foot in Southeast Asia. Vietnam in 1968 was a meat grinder. You have to understand the atmosphere. We were young, we were scared, and we were fighting an enemy that knew the terrain better than we knew our own backyards. But we were Marines. We thought we were the toughest things in the valley. We had the air support, the napalm, and the M16s. We thought we were in control. That was our first mistake. Hill 881 North was a strategic nightmare. It overlooked the Khe Sanh combat base, and the North Vietnamese army wanted it badly. There had been brutal fighting there a year prior, but by April 68, it was supposed to be a quiet sector for Recon. My squad, call sign Viper 6, was sent in for a standard long-range reconnaissance patrol. Our job was to find NVA troop movements and call in the heavy metal. There were 6 of us. Myself, Corporal Stitch Moretti, our radio operator, Sparky Chen, and 3 privates fresh out of Paris Island, Miller, Henderson, and Young. We were inserted by Huey at dusk. The moment the bird lifted off and the sound of the rotors faded into the distance, a heavy, unnatural silence dropped over us. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. The first day was uneventful, if you count humping 50-pound rucks through vertical jungle in 100-degree heat as uneventful. We moved slow, cutting our way through the wait-a-minute vines, our eyes scanning every leaf and shadow. By sunset, we reached a small ridge about halfway up the northern slope. That's when we found the first sign that something was wrong. We stumbled onto an NVA outpost. Or what was left of one. There were 4 of them. They were scattered around a cold fire pit. At first, I thought they had been hit by a surprise American patrol. But as I moved closer with my M16 raised, I realized there were no bullet holes. No shrapnel wounds. Their weapons, AK-47s, were still leaning against a tree, untouched. One of the soldiers was curled in a fetal position, his hands clamped over his ears so hard his fingernails had dug into his skull. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, frozen in a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Stitch knelt down to check for a pulse. He looked up at me, his face pale under his camo paint. "Sarge, their bones are mush," he whispered. I reached out and touched the arm of the nearest NVA soldier. It felt like a bag of wet sand. Every bone in his body had been shattered internally, but the skin was almost entirely intact. No bruising, no trauma. Just, crushed from the inside out. "VC, don't do this," Chen said, his voice shaking as he gripped his radio handset. "Nobody does this." I ordered the squad to move out immediately. I didn't care about the mission anymore. My gut was screaming at me that we had walked into a slaughterhouse. We climbed higher, trying to put distance between us and that outpost. We didn't stop until the moon was high. We set up a perimeter in a dense thicket of bamboo. We didn't use lights. We didn't talk. We just sat there, listening to the jungle. But the jungle wasn't making the right noises. Usually, you hear the monkeys, the birds, the endless buzzing of insects. But Hill 881 was dead. The only sound was the wind through the bamboo, which sounded like dry bones rattling. Around midnight, Henderson, who was on first watch, tapped my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just pointed toward the tree line. I wiped the sweat from my eyes and looked. At first, I saw nothing. Then, I saw the eyes. They were large, reflective, and positioned high up in the canopy. About 8 feet off the ground. They weren't the eyes of a cat or a monkey. They were amber, glowing with an intelligence that felt ancient and cold. They didn't blink. They just watched us. I slowly reached for my rifle, but before I could chamber around, the eyes vanished. Not a sound. No branches breaking, no leaves rustling. Just gone. What was that, Sarge? Henderson whispered, his teeth chattering. Was that a rock ape? We had all heard the stories. The rock apes, or Batutut as the locals called them. Big, hairy bipeds that lived in the high ridges. Most guys thought they were just orangutans or large gibbons that the grunts misidentified in the dark. But the eyes I saw were too big for a monkey. And they were too high. Just a leopard, I lied. Stay sharp. But I didn't sleep a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of those amber eyes pressing down on me. The second day was worse. The fog rolled in early, a thick, gray soup that reduced visibility to 10 feet. We were moving through a narrow ravine when the smell hit us. It was a combination of wet dog, rotten copper, and something sharp, like ammonia. It was so thick it made our eyes water. Henderson, who was at the tail end of the line, suddenly let out a muffled grunt. I turned around, expecting to see him tripped on a root. But Henderson wasn't there. His pack was lying in the mud. His rifle was half submerged in a puddle. But Henderson was gone. There was no struggle. No scream. Just a silence that felt like a slap in the face. Henderson. Stitch hissed, moving back toward the pack. I grabbed his webbing and pulled him back. Freeze, I whispered. I scanned the fog, my heart hammering against my ribs. Something moved above us. A dark shape, massive and agile, swung from a teak tree to a rock outcropping. It moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that no human could match. Chen, get on the horn. Request immediate extraction. Tell them we have a man down and we are being tracked by unidentified hostiles. I shouted. Chen scrambled to set up the long wire antenna, his fingers fumbling with the dials. Viper 6 to base. Viper 6 to base. We are under contact. Need an emergency extract at LZ Blue. Over. The radio response was nothing but static. But it wasn't normal atmospheric static. It was rhythmic. Click 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 click. It sounded exactly like the chattering teeth of 1,000 insects. They're jamming us, Chen gasped, looking at the signal meter. Sarge, nothing can jam a PRC-77 in the middle of the jungle. Not unless they have a transmitter right on top of us. That's when the rocks started falling. Small at first, then larger ones, the size of grapefruits. They weren't falling from the sky. They were being hurled with incredible velocity from the ridges above us. One caught Miller in the shoulder, and I heard the bone snap. He went down, howling in pain. I didn't wait for an order. I leveled my M16 at the tree line and let loose a full magazine on auto. The rest of the squad followed suit. The noise was deafening, the muzzle flashes cutting through the fog. We were spraying the canopy, the leaves falling in shreds. But there was no return fire. No shouting in Vietnamese. Just a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground we stood on. It was a sound of pure, predatory amusement. We formed a tight circle around Miller, our barrels pointing outward. "They're not VC, Sarge," Young whimpered, his eyes darting wildly. I saw one. It was huge. It was covered in red hair and it had 6 fingers. I told him to shut up and keep his eyes on his sector. We spent the next 6 hours in that ravine, waiting for the fog to lift. Every few minutes, we would hear a movement in the brush, a heavy, bipedal step that would stop the moment we turned our heads. They were playing with us. They were hurting us. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, we saw the truth. We weren't in a ravine anymore. In our panic and the fog, we had climbed into a natural amphitheater of rock near the summit of Hill 881. The ground was littered with rusted equipment from the French Indochina War. Rotted leather boots, rusted helmets, and bones. So many bones. This was their larder. This was where they brought their kills. Look, Stitch pointed toward the far wall of the amphitheater. There was a cave entrance, and standing in front of it were 3 of them. They weren't monkeys. They were giants. 10 feet tall, at least. Their bodies were covered in thick, matted fur the color of dried blood. Their chests were broad, their arms reaching down past their knees. They didn't have flat faces like apes. They had jutting jaws and deep-set eyes that burned with a malicious, prehistoric light. And they were wearing trophies. One of them had a necklace made of dog tags. Another was holding Henderson's helmet, turning it over in its massive, 6-fingered hands like a curious child with a toy. "Open fire!" I screamed. We unleashed everything we had. M16s, the M60 machine gun, frag grenades. The cave entrance turned into a wall of fire and lead. One of the creatures went down, its chest torn open by a burst from the M60. It let out a shriek that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It wasn't a roar. It was a high-pitched, electronic-sounding wail that shattered the glass on our watches and made our ears bleed. The other 2 didn't flee. They charged. They moved so fast the human I could barely track them. It was a blur of red fur and raw power. Stitch was the first to go. One of the giants grabbed him by the head and literally twisted it off his shoulders before he could even scream. I saw his body fall like a sack of stones, blood spraying the white rocks of the amphitheater. Young tried to run, but a rock the size of a bowling ball caught him in the small of the back, folding him in half. I saw his spine erupt through his shirt. It was a massacre. I was firing blindly, screaming, my vision blurred by tears and sweat. I remember Miller being dragged into the cave, his fingers clawing at the dirt, leaving long furrows in the mud. I remember Chen trying to use his radio as a weapon before a massive hand crushed his skull like a grape. I was the last one. I backed up against the rock wall, my rifle empty, my pistol jammed. One of the creatures approached me. It was the largest one, the leader. It stood over me, its shadow swallowing me whole. It smelled like ancient dust and rot. It leaned down, its face inches from mine. I could see the individual hairs on its muzzle. I could see the double rows of teeth. But it didn't kill me. It looked at me with those amber eyes, and I felt a presence in my mind. It wasn't words, but a sensation. A feeling of witness. It wanted me to see. It wanted one of us to go back and tell the others that this mountain was theirs. That we were the trespassers. It reached out a massive hand and touched the sergeant's stripes on my arm. Then, it let out a low, huffing sound, almost like a laugh, and turned away, vanishing into the darkness of the cave. I don't know how I got off that hill. The official report says I was found wandering the base of the mountain 2 days later by a marine patrol. They said I was delirious, suffering from severe dehydration and shock. They said my squad was missing in action, presumed dead after a massive NVA ambush. They told me that the bodies they recovered were too badly decomposed to show to the families. They gave me a Purple Heart and a ticket home. But before I left Da Nang, a man in a civilian suit, no name, no rank, came to my hospital bed. He didn't ask me what happened. He told me what happened. You were hit by a superior force of NVA regulars, he said, his voice flat and cold. You saw a new type of experimental camouflage. You were traumatized by the loss of your men. That is the only story that exists, Sergeant Mackenzie. If any other story comes out of your mouth, you won't live to see the end of the year. Do you understand? I looked at him, and I saw the same amber light in his eyes. Not literal light, but the same cold, predatory calculation. I realized then that the monsters on the mountain weren't the only ones who wanted the world to stay in the dark. I've lived a long life, but I've never truly left Hill 881. I hear the clicking in the walls of my house. I see the amber eyes in the shadows of the park. They are still out there. In the deep places of the world, where the maps are blank and the governments tell us there is nothing to fear. The rock apes aren't a myth. They are a remnant of a world that was here before us, and they are waiting for us to fail. They are waiting for the jungle to grow back over our cities. I can hear them now, outside my window. The clicking. The heavy footsteps on the porch. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready to see my squad again. I'm ready to tell Henderson, Stitch, and the others that I finally told the truth. If you are listening to this, stay out of the high ridges. Stay out of the places where the silence is too heavy. Because the jungle doesn't just have eyes. It has teeth. And it's always, always hungry. My name is Sergeant Robert Mackenzie. Viper 6 is finally signing off.